Thank you for allowing us to interview. I think we're super excited about this particular wellness center, Brad.
Such a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
So just a bit about us. We are in the gender-based violence space, and this is the first of its kind, exclusively dedicated to issues around gender-based violence nationally and internationally. This is our third edition, so we're still a new baby, but we've had great traction being in this space, and we're quite excited about the growth and the prospect of growth, and also just our little way of bringing a change into the environment. The reason why we're actually keenly interested in equanimity is because our focus in this edition is healing, healing interventions for trauma-based survivors. So yours came out because it's really unique, and it's something that it's airy-fairy in our kind of sphere. Like, we kind of hear of psychedelics, but you only see, when celebrities in America tell you they went down Southern America and they had their Reiki and that kind of stuff. And this is really close to home. So this is why we actually wanted to have a chat with you and see what we can do in terms of bringing what you do as a modality of healing.
It sounds wonderful, and the purpose behind the magazine sounds really, really meaningful. And I can hear there's probably a lot of synergy and alignment between our respective visions or purposes.
So just tell me a bit about you.
Sure. So I'm a clinical psychologist by profession. I have been qualified since 2013. I have been in private practice for the last 9 years, but more uniquely to what we're talking about now, for the last 2.5 years, I've been working quite actively in the psychedelic assisted therapy space, running retreats, as well as with the Wellness Centre, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And when I'm not consulting, you find me doing yoga, reading a lot, spending time in nature with my partner, playing with my cats, attempting to do jiu-jitsu.
Oh, that's a nice one. And why did you decide to start Equanimity?
So, being a clinical psychologist over the last decade, and really being kind of in the coalface and getting a first-hand sense of the kinds of challenges that people struggle with, getting experience around the kinds of tools that we have available to us and the sorts of shifts that you could see with the current therapeutic tools that we have, while extremely rewarding and powerful. I think I share a frustration that a lot of my colleagues have as well, which is that we don't see the kinds of shifts that we would like to see. People take a long time to recover from whatever they struggle with. Very often you see a kind of what we call a revolving door phenomenon, where people will get better and then they'll regress and they'll kind of just come back. And so it became apparent to myself and to some of my colleagues that psychiatry and psychology desperately need better, alternative and more effective tools at our disposal to really, really help people recover. In some senses, psychiatry and clinical psychology haven't had major breakthroughs in the last 50 years, which is very different to other spheres of medicine. And this has something to do with early policy making in the 70s, especially in America, around psychedelic medicine. But really the drive towards equanimity was driven by a kind of a disillusionment and a frustration, just a yearning to really want to make a bigger impact and make a difference. And it became clear to us that the most powerful tools available were these psychedelic medicines. And when those medicines were coupled with traditional therapy, the traditional skills that we've all been trained in, the outcomes could be nothing short of remarkable. Certainly not miraculous. We don't view it as a panacea, as an all cure, but it is a very potent catalyst for the traditional therapeutic work that we do. So that was the main driver behind forming equanimity.
I'm hearing that you opted to steer a different course and try something different in terms of your approach. So let's get into the whole psychedelic. What do you mean by psychedelic? Let's start there.
So the word psychedelic means mind manifesting. These are compounds that manifest one's mind to themselves. They show you components of your mind that are otherwise out of awareness. What these compounds do in manifesting your mind to yourself is they create profound alterations in consciousness. So they can induce hallucinations, they can induce fundamental shifts in your perception of reality, of yourself, of time. And so this is what these medicines do. Psychedelic assisted therapy is the use of these compounds within a therapeutic context to catalyze healing and recovery.
If somebody's hallucinating and is in a mind-altered state, how does it induce healing?
It's a really profound question. The short answer is that we don't know entirely yet. We're still figuring out how it fundamentally induces healing and recovery. But from what we understand is that what the psychedelic does is that it shuts down certain networks in the brain, certain networks that are active and busy when human beings are in states of anxiety, of depression, worry, rumination, essentially when we're lost in thought, when we're perpetually in our minds thinking without knowing we're thinking. And for anyone suffering with depression, with addiction, with trauma, there is this heightened state of rumination, of being kind of just lost in thought all the time. And that's a defense mechanism that the mind puts in place. And what the latest neuroscience is showing is that these compounds shut down that network. It's known as the default mode network. Mm-hmm. And when that network shuts down, distant parts of the brain are allowed to activate and communicate and connect. Mm-hmm. And that's really interesting because that process, which is known as neurogenesis, which is the formation of new neural pathways in the brain, what that leads to are deep shifts in our perceptions of ourselves, of our trauma, of our past, of our future. And with those deep perspective shifts comes a widening of emotional range. So all of a sudden you have access to a deeper panoply of emotional experiences that otherwise you didn't have access to. And then that can lead to behavior change. Now you're in a position, because you've created what's known as neuroplasticity in the brain through this process of neurogenesis. Now you're in a position to take on habits and routines that will help and serve you to heal and recover. So at a very high level, at the level of the brain, that's what neuroscientists think these compounds are doing. Essentially, it's the same objective as traditional therapy. Traditional therapy also tries to recreate neural pathways and increase synaptic density and synaptic efficiency. The only difference is that it takes a very, very long time. So the metaphor that we sometimes like to use at Equanimity is we say that if you imagine the brain as a block of clay, what traditional therapy tries to do is chip away at that dry clay over time and resculpt the psyche. Now that can work, it just takes a long time. What these psychedelic medicines do is they heat up the clay of the mind, making the clay malleable and soft. Now you can remold the mind in a very, very short space of time. So essentially the psychedelic heats up the clay of the mind. And now that the mind is malleable, you come in with traditional therapy and you sculpt it in the way that's beneficial and optimal for the person.
So you say you're creating new neural pathways. So basically you're allowing the mind to transcend beyond its limitation.
Absolutely.
Now, saying this is an uncharted area, what are the possibilities of actually reintroducing trauma, like a certain degree of trauma? Because I'm so used to my defense systems, and all of a sudden this flood of emotions come through, or this realization. Is that not secondary traumatization, and how do you handle that? And how safe is your space? How much containment do you have for such cases?
It's such a brilliant question, Hazel. And The fact of the matter is, I don't want to downplay the risks. The fact is that these medicines aren't for everyone. There are certain people who have underlying predispositions to certain illnesses like schizophrenia or any kind of psychotic disorder, where the mind is already in an extremely fragile state, and it is not helpful to the person to further fragment the mind. Whatever defense mechanisms they have that are trying to hold them together, it's not beneficial to come in with a psychedelic compound and obliterate those defenses. So there are contraindications for these medicines. And in fact, we spend a great deal of time ruling people out rather than taking them in for the treatment. That's really important to consider. For people who don't have these underlying predispositions, schizophrenia, psychosis, active mania as found in bipolar disorder, this medicine is extremely beneficial, because what we find in conditions like major depressive disorder, chronic anxiety, addiction, severe OCD, severe eating disorders, what we find is that people's defense mechanisms are actually too rigid, they're too stuck. And so the psychedelic's capacity to soften and break down those defense mechanisms really is precisely the medicine that they need. The mind is too rigid, it needs to be fragmented in a certain way in order for them to heal and recover. But very importantly, and back to your question, even for those people, this is only beneficial within a very particular and rigorous therapeutic framework. And fortunately, institutions like Johns Hopkins, Harvard, Yale, Imperial College London, trailblazing, amazing scientists and clinicians from those universities have created a 3-part framework that allow the person to go through this experience in a way that is optimal and safe. And what this requires the person to go through extremely thorough and careful preparation, where you're getting very clear on what their intentions are for this plant medicine journey or this ketamine assisted therapy journey. You're doing a deep dive into their background, into their life story. So you're learning what their defense mechanisms are, where their vulnerabilities are, and what sort of experience would be optimal for them. And you're also doing a thorough screening and assessment to rule out any of these contraindications. So phase 1 is preparation. Phase 2 is the medicine journey itself. And there are certain parameters that we pay attention to ensure that the experience is safe and meaningful. And so we modify the environment. We know what to do with the space to make people feel contained and held and safe in order to have their mind manifested to them, which could otherwise be an overwhelming and scary experience. And finally, and most importantly, phase 3 is what we call integration. Now, this is the most important phase. This is where the individual gets to translate the insights that they've had from the journey into some kind of meaningful and lasting behavior change, because that's what this is all about. It's ultimately about behavior change. Hence, the psychedelic is just a catalyst towards some kind of meaningful behavior change. And so it takes a really well-trained clinician to know how to integrate someone. You know, if you're going to fragment the mind and pull the defense mechanisms apart, you're going to take this clay and heat it up. You better offer someone a really structured and rigorous program to put themselves back together again in the right way. And unfortunately, this is the deficit that at Equanimity, this is the deficit that we've seen in some shamanic or non-empirically verified models, is that there isn't careful screening, there isn't thorough preparation, there's minimal attention paid to the setting of the medicine journey itself, and there's almost no integration therapy. And so the medicine journey itself, at best, can just become a memory of a dream, you know, just a memory of this transcendent experience you had, and at worst, it can be a trauma.
I was actually going to ask you what the difference is between Reiki, for example, and what you do. I think you've just kind of clarified it.
Correct.
Yeah, there's the clinical side and there's the support. Would you be able to give us an example of a patient, a typical patient that comes through from the beginning until the end? the transformation. I would like to have that visual imprint in my mind.
An example of the kind of presentation that we might see, I'll draw on an actual case presentation. I'll alter some of the details just to protect the identity of the client, but I have spoken about this case in presentations. So, for example, I worked with a young man who came to me, presented with major depressive disorder, severe social anxiety, OCD, a whole host of psychiatric clinical diagnoses. Despite that, he was functional, he could work, to some degree, he was maintaining his relationships, but he was deeply unhappy, and he had a deeply conflicted relationship to himself. He also had elaborate patterns of avoidance and emotional numbing and kind of fear of people. So by all means, on the surface, a functional person, but deep down, incredibly unhappy, and a very conflicted relationship to himself, full of self-loathing, self-criticism, a really harsh, punitive inner voice that was kind of always badgering him. And what he'd said to me when he came to us was that, he'd gotten a lot of value out of his previous therapy, but he felt that it hit a wall, it hit a limitation. He'd wondered whether, when he was young, whether he'd experienced some trauma. He seemed to have accessed in his previous therapy certain memories of things that might have happened to him, but he wasn't sure. He really wasn't certain. And he wanted to explore psychedelic medicine to try and catalyze and deepen his healing journey and to try to get more insight into himself. We took him through a protocol, which, phase 1 is very careful screening to rule out any contraindications, any medical or psychological contraindications. There were none, so he was safe. We could proceed. I went into a deep exploration of his life story or his psychobiography, just getting deep insight into where he's come from, what his relationships were like with his parents, what he remembers from his childhood, and starting to build a case as to how his early experiences have shaped him and contributed to some of the things that he's struggling with today. That process of psychobiography led into setting very clear intentions for his psychedelic journey, what he wanted to get out of it. And what he wanted to get out of it, he wanted to create a deeper connection to himself. He wanted to connect more to his body. He was incredibly cerebral and disconnected from himself. He wanted to cultivate a more compassionate and kind relationship to himself. And he also wanted to just get insight, get clarity into, where does this depression, this anxiety, where does it come from? What's the root of it, if anything? So those were his intentions. From there, we spent a little bit of time with what we call skills training. So before just launching someone into a psychedelic journey, we give them hands-on real-time tools that they can use if they need to ground themselves, if they need to stabilize and calm themselves during the experience. Because while the experience can be intensely beautiful and you can cry tears of joy, it can be beautiful and blissful, it can also be challenging. You can confront early trauma, you can confront aspects and emotions, parts of yourself that you haven't been connected to for a long time, and that can be intense and overwhelming sometimes. And so we give people mindfulness-based tools. We teach them how to breathe, how to put their attention in the right place, how not to resist the experience, how to lean in and to let go and to flow with the experience. So here we're drawing on traditional therapy modalities like cognitive behavior therapy and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. So we gave him some skills training as well. So that was all phase 1 for this gentleman. Then moving into phase 2 was the medicine journey itself. And at Equanimity, we use a particular legal psychedelic medicine called ketamine, which we can talk about a little bit more as we go along. So he had his ketamine infusions, and he had some really fascinating experiences in his infusions. I'll just highlight one or two things that he did experience in his journey. The one thing that he experienced was he felt himself traveling inside his body through all its systems and tributaries and capillaries, as if he was this tiny little version of himself, and it was just going through his body. And as he was traveling inside, he happened upon this dark black mass, almost like this mass of tar inside his body. And what he understood that black mass to be, he said that was his shame. That was his inner core of shame and corruption. So that's the critical voice that he had, that there was something wrong with him, that he was corrupt, that he's ashamed of himself. He could see this physical manifestation of this in the form of this black tar. And then he said something very interesting happened. As he was exploring this black mass, a dark light started to surround this mass. And slowly, the dark light transformed into this glowing orb. And eventually this mass was replaced with this glowing orb. And he felt that what he understood that to be was something good had taken residence inside his body for the first time. And he said that he'd never experienced the good parts of himself as a physical thing. And this is one of the magics of, this is part of the magic of psychedelic medicine, is it takes insights that would otherwise be intellectual or cerebral, and it makes them manifest physically with the force of an emotion. So this is why when people do psychedelic medicine, they say, look, I've known intellectually what smoking has been doing to my body, but in the journey, I felt it with the force of an emotion. I could feel what smoking was doing to my body. And that's how we change. When we can feel what we're doing, we can feel what a pattern of thinking is doing to us, or a way of speaking to ourselves is doing to us, then we shift. So he said he felt a good component physically within himself, and that was really profound for him. And then in integration therapy, the question is, how do we translate that into some kind of meaningful and lasting behavior change? And so we said, okay, well, let's suppose that your core is not just inherently corrupt, that your self is composed of some good parts. How would you behave? What would you do differently day to day with a more ambivalent sense of yourself? And he said, well, for starters, I would put more boundaries down with people. I wouldn't let people walk over me. I'd be more assertive. I'd consider my needs in addition to other people's needs. And he said, okay, great. So we established a hierarchy of different people and interactions in his life where he normally lacks assertiveness. And we said, we're going to experiment. We're going to perform an exposure exercise. You're going to practice the skill of assertiveness with these people. And that's your exercise for the next week. Other things like just self-care, basic self-care. He said, like I'd stop pouring toxins down my throat. You know, if I valued myself and I felt that actually I'm not just inherently corrupt, I'm worthy of love and self-care, I would stop treating myself this way. And he did, and he was able to drop some really bad habits. And you know, traditional therapy had rightly encouraged him to similar kinds of exercises, but ultimately he always reneged because he didn't have a felt sense of why he ought to do this. And that's in part what the journey gave him. I'll share one more highlight from his second infusion, because with ketamine, you do multiple infusions. It's not just one big journey like other plant medicines. In another infusion, he found himself locked in a bathroom. And he said it was like watching a black and white film of himself. It almost had no emotional resonance. It was like this black and white movie without the soundtrack, essentially. And he saw himself as a little boy locked in a bathroom. And then what he had a vision was of someone hurting him in the toilet cubicle. And during our integration session, when he came out of the journey, he said he thinks he remembers what happened to him. He said that when he was very young, he was at a quiet sports stadium with his family. He needed the bathroom. His parents told him to wait for him. Don't go without us. Don't go alone. He wanted to feel brave. He wanted to go on an adventure. He wanted to explore himself. He wanted to feel like a big boy. So he went on his own. And unfortunately, someone followed him into one of the cubicles and molested him. And now he understood what that black mass, that shame, that internal sense of disgust with himself was. He believed that he brought this on himself. That his lack of responsibility, his arrogance, it was his fault. His parents told him to wait for him, and he didn't. And he, unfortunately, because he was so ashamed and he was so terrified that his parents would punish him for this, that almost see him as him being, he did something wrong. He kept it a secret, and over time the secret was suppressed. And unfortunately, when you suppress a trauma of that nature over time, how that manifests later in life is chronic anxiety, addiction, severe depression, and OCD. Had all these elaborate rituals around bathrooms. And so in the journey, he was able to get insight into what actually happened to him. And now the difficult but meaningful work of trauma processing was allowed to begin. And that took us on a very intense but purposeful journey around, getting him to a place where he can grieve for what was lost, for a component of his childhood was lost, where he could find some forgiveness towards himself, where he could reappraise this experience and realize that he didn't do anything wrong. He was being a little boy. He wanted to explore. He wanted to feel brave. This is what little boys do. So essentially coming to a place of self-forgiveness. And through a lot of therapy and a lot of careful processing and integration, I'm really happy to say that he's finally at a place where chronic anxiety is remitted. He doesn't meet criteria for major depression. He's no longer abusing himself with toxic substances, and his relationships are deepening and improving. And so, could we have gotten there with traditional therapy? Yes. Would it have taken 3 years? Probably. We got there in 4 months.
Wow.
And that's the power of this medicine. But again, only within a safe therapeutic context can you even dream of going to a place like this with someone.
So when I listen to this entire process that you've gone through with this gentleman, I see how valuable your healing modality would be in the gender-based violence space. So my question is, do you hold space? Can victims of gender-based violence access your services? Is that the right space for them?
Absolutely. We have worked with victims of gender-based violence. It's a particularly insidious and horrible form of trauma, and we have worked with it before. And as with anybody, we would take the individual through our protocol. We'd take them through our screening, our preparation process. We would never take someone into a journey like this if they weren't ready and they weren't prepared, or if there were contraindications where we felt that it could do more damage than help them. But having safely guided hundreds of people through these experiences, we've never ever had a situation where the process landed up re-traumatizing them in a way that wasn't helpful. So we're confident, can confidently say that because we invest so much time and so much rigor into the therapeutic framework, this would be a very, very safe and healing option for people who've struggled with gender-based violence. So
I'm coming in as a victim. Do you have dedicated programs for victims, or it's case by case? So it could be somebody struggling with a different clinical psychological problem. Do you have special programs for gender-based violence victims?
The specificity of the protocol of the intervention, that is completely dependent on the expertise of the therapist working with the person. So in the same way that no two people will get the same therapy intervention in a traditional therapeutic approach, mm-hmm. They will not get the same cookie cutter approach in this space as well. The only thing that is the same is the process of the medicine journey itself. There, the process is standard, it's systematic, everyone does the same, they have the same medicine, they do it in the same space, but the integration therapy will look completely different. And the reason for that is because everyone would have had a different life story, they would have set different intentions. An experienced clinician will know how to craft and tailor make the therapy, the integration therapy for that particular individual based on their trauma, based on their defense mechanisms, based on their underlying history. And that's the beauty of our approach, is that it takes really experienced therapists to be able to do that. And we make no compromise on that. In fact, that is how we see how we differentiate from other modalities.
Your integration is custom made. Can we talk about the ketamine, which is standard?
Yes, absolutely.
What is that?
It's a great question.
It do?
Great question. So ketamine was originally developed all the way back in the the 70s or even the 60s as an anesthetic. So in traditional medical settings, ketamine is used as an anesthetic. It's an FDA approved medicine. It was developed because it had such an excellent safety profile. It was a much safer alternative to the anesthetics that they were using at the time, something called phencyclidine or PCP for short. The reason ketamine was so safe as an anesthetic is because it didn't suppress the cardiovascular system. This is why ketamine is safely and routinely administered to children, even in medical settings today. So that was ketamine's on-label use as an anesthetic agent. Because it's so safe, it appears on the World Health Organization's list of what they call essential medicines. So in the year 2000, some really, really smart scientists and researchers at Yale University figured out that if you administer a sub-anesthetic dose of ketamine to people struggling with depression, and by sub-anesthetic, I mean, 1/10 of the dose that would normally be given, let's say, to a child in a medical setting. So a tiny, tiny dose. If you administered it to people struggling with treatment-resistant depression, they enjoyed almost miraculous remission from their symptoms, rapid and robust remission from their symptoms. The reason for this is because up until now, and this is why I said in the beginning, I don't know if I put it this way, but psychiatry really hasn't had major breakthroughs in 50 years. The reason for that is because we've been treating people with depression with medicines, antidepressants, that work on something called the serotonin system. Mm-hmm. The serotonin system accounts for a relatively small proportion of neurons in the brain. What ketamine does, and this is what was so ingenious about these scientists at Yale University, they said, hang on, there's a set of neurons in the brain that rely on a different system called the glutamate system. And now it just so happens that people with treatment-resistant depression, all of the things that glutamate impacts in the brain, memory, learning, drive, executive function, this all depends so much on glutamate, this other neurochemical in the brain. Why are we just zooming in and focusing on serotonin when there's this far broader global network in the brain that relies on glutamate? What if we give an agent that allows for a pulse of glutamate to surge through the brain? Let's see what that does with people with depression. And so they did, and it just so happened that ketamine was one such substance. When you administer ketamine, it triggers a surge of glutamate in the brain, and so they did, and the results were nothing short of astounding. For example, people coming in on day one saying, I'm so suicidal, people who are so suicidal that need to be admitted, and after one 50-minute infusion would come out and say, I don't feel suicidal anymore. I almost feel like I have a new brain. I can see colors for the first time in years. So that was the miracle of ketamine for depression, and it was quickly described as the biggest breakthrough in depression treatment in 50 years. So that was the good news. There was one catch. And the catch was that within 7 to 12 days, the benefits started to wane. People started to regress back into their depressive cycle. And so what quickly became apparent was that once you've administered the ketamine and you've created this beautiful window of neurological opportunity in the brain, you've created this neuroplasticity. If you don't come in with the right therapy, the right integration therapy, you don't come in with cognitive behavior therapy and a structured program for habit change, then the benefits don't last. If you come in with CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, habit change, and careful integration therapy, the amazing thing was that then the benefits would last, and they could last for months and months and months. And then it was a situation of people, needing maybe to come in for a top-up infusion once every 6 months, and then just simply enjoying and sustaining the benefits through therapy and habit change. So that's ketamine in a nutshell.
What are the possibilities of becoming addicted to it or dependent on it?
It's a great question, Hazel, and such an important question. The fact is that ketamine does show some potential for psychological addiction, not physiological addiction, some potential for psychological addiction in recreational settings. It's really important, though, to emphasize that the way ketamine is administered in a clinical setting, like the way we administered it at Equanimity Wellness, is that it's medically supervised, the dose is controlled, the doses are so minuscule and so small that the prospect of becoming dependent are virtually impossible. Our clinical protocols completely disallow someone from becoming hooked because we simply won't allow people to come back for infusion after infusion after infusion, no matter how much they love it or how much they want to. So the goal is the least amount of infusions necessary to get well, and then to sustain the benefits through therapy and habit change. I think it's really important just to point out here as well a study, a landmark study that was done by Professor David Nutt from Johns Hopkins University in 2019, where he compared 22 substances for harm potential. This included addictive potential, physiological harm. When you look at the ranking of these substances, and this is a bit of a trigger warning for everyone, the first 5 substances, the most addictive and dangerous substances on earth: number 1, alcohol; number 2, crystal meth; number 3, heroin; number 4, crack cocaine and cocaine. So that's right at the top. Right at the bottom, even below cannabis, ketamine, psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, MDMA. So I think that our perception of ketamine has been distorted by the recreational scene, where people are using unregulated doses at volumes that and frequencies that they shouldn't be using. They're mixing it and contaminating it with alcohol and other substances at the same time. We don't know what the quality of the ketamine is that they're using. Most of the time it's not medical grade, and it's in the wrong environment. And yes, under those conditions, any substance that's used out of context with the wrong intention can become harmful in some way.
How accessible is ketamine?
So ketamine is in America, they'd call it a Schedule 6 drug, which means that only a medical professional can access it. Okay. So it's not legal for possession and use by every man on the street, only administered by a qualified medical professional.
What I find very interesting is that the highly addictive substances are the ones that are easily accessible.
It's remarkable.
The ones that are really safe are classified as have great restriction. This is very interesting.
It's remarkable.
Yeah. So just as we're winding down, I just want to ask 2 questions in terms of the controversialness of psychedelics. I know you've mentioned that in the whole psychiatry and psychology world, there hasn't been much breakthrough or much progress in the last 50 years. Now you're introducing this revolutionary approach, and there's a lot of controversy around it. What are some of the controversies, and how are you maneuvering around those controversies?
I think the current controversies are, first of all, just an unfortunate lack of insight and knowledge about these medicines and about their value and their benefit, even within the medical communities. And unfortunately, that does lead to stigma and myths and all sorts of misapprehensions about these medicines. For example, one of them is like, they'll just induce psychosis. You'll have a psychotic break if you take psychedelics. And again, yes, any medicine that is used out of context, without the right protocols, without the right framework, with the wrong intention, can be harmful. So that's one of the controversies. The other controversy or myth that seems to be that percolates at the moment, and again, it's understandable because this is purely a function of time. South Africa is we often are very conservative, and we're often catching up in many aspects of technology and advancement and medicine, and it is something about our beautiful country as well, is that we're quite conservative, and so it's understandable that something like this that is so novel, that is so cutting edge, will take time for people to get used to. But the other misapprehension that circulates around is that they're not as powerful as people think they are, because out of the 3,000 peer-reviewed studies that show efficacy, they might point to a handful that say, oh, but the benefits aren't long-lasting and the benefits wane. And an important question to ask in that regard is, compared to what? Compared to SSRIs with a 33 to 48% efficacy rate? Like yes, of course, ketamine isn't a panacea. It's not a magic bullet, but it's a hell of a lot better than anything else that's available to us at the moment. And so those are some of the misapprehensions that circulate. The way that we're trying to correct for those narratives is by being extremely responsible and careful and thorough with our therapeutic framework. We are trying to move away from a trend that relies too heavily on the medicine to do the work. We're trying to win the therapeutic community by showing them that no, the magic isn't in the medicine. It's in the therapy, it's in the integration therapy, where you get to translate these insights into actual behavior change. We do not view psychedelic medicine as a replacement for what you're doing. It's another tool in a vast toolbox, and it's but one tool in the toolbox. All this medicine does is it just speeds up and catalyzes the amazing, beautiful work that you're already doing, so that the two work together. It's not a replacement or an either or, essentially. And I think the way that we do that is by really just fleshing out the therapeutic protocol, focusing on the therapy, making it less about the ketamine and more about the CBT, the mindfulness-based practices, the trauma processing. Drawing on the amazing clinical techniques and interventions that people far smarter than ourselves have built over the last 100 years.
I think it's very important. What you mentioned is that it's simply a tool. It is by no means the remedy or the solution. It is simply a piece of the puzzle. Critical, but it's only a piece of it. I think that's very important for our listeners, our readers, to understand. So as we're closing out, I just wanted to understand, how accessible are your interventions?
Yeah, so we've done our absolute best to make it as cost effective and as accessible as possible. Unfortunately, the treatment is rather expensive. You're looking at 3,200 Rand for a journey, for an infusion. The good news is that what that comes with is, and this is how we've tried to make it more accessible, is that we've packaged it with integration therapy. So in any other setting, you would just go for an infusion, and then you would have to go off to your own therapist and pay an additional 1,500 Rand for a therapy session to try and make sense of this 3,000 Rand infusion. We've packaged it. So say, 3,200 Rand, here's the journey, here's the preparation, here's the intention setting, and here's the integration therapy. So we've really, really tried to make it more manageable from that point of view. Fortunately, medical aids do currently cover on specific plans a fair proportion of that fee. So that really has made it more accessible and manageable to people. But our long-term dream is to find a way to make this accessible en masse. That would be that for us. We talk about our mission at Equanimity as reducing unnecessary suffering in the world by doing something purpose-driven, by leaving this reality a little bit better than the way we found it. And if we could find a way in time to make it accessible en masse, I'm pretty sure we would all die happy.
Absolutely. I mean, our nation is a traumatized nation, so there's a lot of work to be done. Exactly. A heck of a lot of work to be done.
It's true. It's true.
And all the best. And thank you so much for allowing us to interview you. How do we get a hold of you?
So the best way to get a hold of us is to contact our head of operations, Gina Feynman. She can be contacted at gina@equanimitywellness.co.za. I'll also get her just to share her direct line as well, her phone number as well. You can also find us on Instagram. There's a lot of information there with links to our work too. The Instagram handle there is just Equanimity Wellness. And of course, our website, Equanimity Wellness.
And where are you based?
In Sandton. So in the heart of Sandton, we're in Grayston. We're just off Grayston Drive.
Thank you so much for this time. I'm sure we will be back, and we're coming for our trip.
We would be absolutely honored to have you. And thank you so much for giving us the time. We're extremely grateful.
No, it's a pleasure.